Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Lowdown on Lowcode, brought to you by analysis.tech. Before we get started, if you enjoy the podcast, if you're getting good information out of it, please like us, tell your friends. This is a great resource for the entire Lowcode community. My name's John Rymer. I'm an analyst here at analysis.tech. Worked for about 25 years as an industry analyst, most recently at Forrester. And while at Forrester, with another analyst, with a colleague, I coined the term low code. So if you don't like it, you can blame me. And I'm thrilled to be here today with my colleague and longtime collaborator, Rob Koplowitz. Rob, how you doing?
I'm doing good, John. Thank you so much for hosting today. This, I think, is going to be a really good one. So I'm excited to get kicked off here.
Great. So we today are going to do something a little bit different. We have invited a long-time friend. I'm not going to call you an old friend, but a long-time friend, James Taylor, not the guitarist, singer-songwriter. James, I met James, I was thinking today, it was like 22 years ago?
Something like that, yeah.
Something like that. James's career has always been about automating decisions with software. And about applications we called most recently digital decisioning. And this is a kind of a niche, but with the current rage about AI and AI becoming infused into all aspects of software development, James, we believe there's nobody better actually to help us understand a couple of really important points. One point that we're hoping to discuss with you, James, is we hear all the time, don't worry, AI agents are not going to take your job, and they're not going to, result in lots and lots of layoffs. Rather, what's going to happen is we're going to build applications using AI that are going to make people more effective in their jobs. And if that's the case, well, first of all, low code will be used extensively to build those applications. So the two come together. And if that's the case, we're going to make people more effective in their jobs. We think we've run smack into the world of digital decisioning, because how do you make people effective in their jobs? Well, a big way is to make the decisions they make more effective. So that's a little bit different, but we think it's a really important topic, and we're thrilled that you're here, James.
Well, thank you. I'm
so much.
Glad to be here. Yeah.
So, James, we always like to start. Tell us a little bit about how you got here, a little bit about your background and your journey.
Sure. So I started off in software in the UK a long time ago, and I moved to the US because I really wanted to work building software, not just like supporting it. And at the time, there weren't really many European software companies. So I moved to the States. I'm involved in case tools and modeling tools, computer-aided software engineering, modeling tools. And I spent some time writing methodology for Ernst & Young, sort of how do you build then the bright new shiny thing, client server. And then I go to PeopleSoft. I joined the R&D group at PeopleSoft. PeopleSoft's R&D working on event-based, object-oriented Java systems when all of those words made you a crazy person. Any one of them made you a crazy person, let alone all of them as a set, right? And then, I got into business rules management systems. I kept recommending it to product teams, engineering teams, and they kept saying, no, we'll just write code. And in the end, I got fed up. And I went to work for a business rules management system company. Soon after that is when I met you, because you were starting to talk about business rules and business rules management. And over the next couple of years, this is now the early 2000s, I became part of Fair Isaac's organization through H&C and Brocat and various other things. And Fair Isaac at the time had these decisioning applications for fraud detection, for account management, for customer management, for originations that were hugely successful in banks. And we knew they were a class of application, and then we knew they used a stack of technology, but it had no name. Fraud detection systems were called fraud detection systems, and origination systems were called origination systems. And so I coined the phrase decision management to talk about this as a thing and try and pull these tools together and say there's a class of application, a decision management application that pulls these things together and does it. And I've been doing that basically ever since, as you pointed out, which is a really long time, right? So, but what's interesting about it, back then, I remember doing an analyst study and we got this great feedback. They said, well, we got good news and bad news about this study, right? What's the good news? Well, the good news is your systems, these decision management systems, are the highest ROI analytics systems in our study. And we're like, oh, that's great. What could possibly be the bad news? Oh, they're also by far the most expensive. That's the bad news. So back then, only banks could really afford to do this kind of stuff because you had to have an enormous number of transactions that were enormously expensive to justify the cost.
Right.
Now, not so much. So over the last 20 years, the cost of the tech has gone down, the techniques for using it's gone down, the tech's got better, analytics, machine learning, AI, all this stuff has evolved, but the fundamental problem remains the same. How do you effectively automate this decision making so you can make better, more targeted, more granular, more fine-grained, more automatic decisions for all the systems you use? So I'm still doing that.
Right. I just want to mention to folks that your company, Polaris,
yes,
is devoted to these helping people deliver these applications.
Absolutely. We used to be called Decision Management Solutions, which was a dead giveaway, right? So the Decision Management Solutions is what we did. But over the last few years, we've broadened our sort of portfolio a little bit. We do a lot more work in process. We do a lot more work in governance. We do a lot more work with AI and machine learning and decision management. Got a little bit pigeonholed as being very rules-centric, even though it never was. And so Polaris and this sort of focus on insightful action, right? This idea of saying, well, how do you take the right action, the one that's driven by your insights and deliver that is really where we're focused. So that's now everything from orchestration and workflow through, decisioning and machine learning and AI and generative AI and a bunch of things around, using AI both as an interface technology and as part of the decisioning environment itself.
Right.
So, that's what we do. We build these things for people, often typically for very large companies, and helping them adopt and use these technologies. Yeah.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Rob, over to you.
So James, let's go back to the elephant in the corner that John pointed out in his intro, which is that all this AI stuff is just going to steal all the human jobs. What is going to be the impact? I mean, are these going to strictly augment human jobs, which we often hear? We also hear that they're going to replace a lot of human jobs. Where in your mind does the reality lie around the impact of AI on the workforce doing the type of work that we're focused on?
So I think it's going to do both. I do think it's going to eliminate a huge number of jobs, not in terms of whole jobs going away, but in terms of me needing one person instead of 99 people. And I think it will also dramatically change a lot of jobs. And I think the challenge here is really going to come down to company strategy, right? There's this issue of like, well, if I can do something much more effectively, do I say, great, I'll do it more effectively, I'll make more money? Or do I say, great, I can do it more effectively so I can save my costs by doing less people? We do a lot of work in like a loan origination. So talking to auto lenders. So you're talking to an auto lender. They make a lot of offers to people that don't get accepted. Now, it turns out if you can make an offer in real time to someone while they're in the dealer, instead of a few hours later, you're much more likely to get accepted. The accept rate goes way up, right? So you could view this two ways, right? You could say, that's great. That means I can make real-time offers. I'll have a bigger book of business. And I don't need to, and it's all automated, so I don't need any manual staff. So my business grows. I make more money. This is all great. I just don't need to hire any more staff, right? But you could also say, I spend hours looking at these goddamn applications. I could get the same level of business with 1/10 the number of staff I have. So it really depends whether you think you A, want to grow your business, and B, can. Is there a pool of people? If let's say you're a subprime lender specializing in RVs in Western Canada, well, perhaps you already have most of the market. So it doesn't do you much good to be able to grow your business with the same staff. You're going to be focused on, great, now I can have lower costs. But if on the other hand you do, I don't know, EVs in California, you might say, terrific, I can totally kill it here because there's lots of market, right? So I think it's just going to come down to company strategy. And I think you could use the tech both ways. I think you could absolutely eliminate jobs and you could absolutely improve the effectiveness of the people doing the jobs.
There's probably a piece of this that speaks to the economic climate as well, right, James?
Absolutely,
Different economic trends are going to lead to different business, taking advantage of different business strategies. John, over to you.
And different industries too. Sorry,
different industries, of course, right?
Yeah,
the more mature industries are going to and the more regulated industries are gonna do things very differently than
Absolutely.
or emerging and less regulated.
Right. Right. That's a great point. So thinking about the companies who decide that they want to grow by being more effective in their business, or they want to, expand their customer satisfaction or whatever it happens to be. It seems to us that in our industry, in IT and tech, we're not very good at measuring the return on IT investments that contribute to effectiveness. We're really good at efficiency. There's usually a straight line. It's people replaced by automation, right? Pretty simple. But effectiveness, and we know what that means: profitability, customer sat, growth, whatever it is, we're achieving our goals as a business. It seems to us that if we're going to that if part of the big value of AI is going to be effectiveness, we're going to have to get much, much better at justifying those investments. Do you agree? And have you seen folks crack this nut and really make the connection?
I absolutely do agree. I think we've just had these arguments with these folks looking at auto originations, right? This is exactly the same thing. So you run the cost of building a decision engine and automating these decisions. Here's the cost. Okay, well, what's the benefit? And they immediately go to less time doing manual review, fewer errors, and we're like, no, wait. The evidence is that real-time offers have a higher accept rate. So your book of business gets bigger for the same amount of effort, but you have to have that data. So I would say, not only do you have to think differently about how you're going to measure it, you have to have industry-level competitive data. And we have this because people move between banks and lenders, and they do studies. And so they're like, well, I remember when I was in Bank X, we did a study comparing the real-time accept rates with the non-real-time accept rates, and this is what we found, right? And you get a few of these data points, and they might be official benchmarks, but more likely they're internal benchmarking, right?
Right.
And then you can say, great, we've got this. We know this is a measure of effectiveness. And so we can use it, right? But it would be better if there was benchmarking that was focused on effectiveness, because then I agree with you. Otherwise, it's really hard to do some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I'm imagining that a lot of companies just don't, as you say, they don't have the data.
No, right.
Even if they understood how they wanted to measure it or had an idea of how they want to measure it, if you don't have the data, you're kind of stuck.
Absolutely. The banks, for instance, will do a lot of work with champion challenger, right? This idea of saying, I've got two strategies, right? A champion strategy and one or more challenger strategies that are a little bit different. And I don't just run them in a simulation environment like a digital twin, right? I do that, but then I also deploy it. So James and John and Rob all come to the bank, and we've all got the same old white guy profile, right? So we're all the same. Yeah, we all look the same to the bank. Well, I get the champion strategy, offers me a certain card with a certain limit, blah, blah, blah. And John gets Challenger 1 and Rob gets Challenge 2. And I wait 12 months. And then I compare all the people who got, right? And I say, well, did I make more money out of John or Rob or James, right?
Uh-huh.
And then if I make more money, then that becomes my new champion strategy, right?
Uh-huh.
But that's a huge infrastructure investment in like that kind of testing and thinking about it and waiting while it plays out, because it's not like the red button's better than a blue button, which I can find out instantly. I have to wait a few months to see if you use the product, and do I make money out of you, and do you return shit, and are you a complainer, all these things, right? And most, in our experience, having now delivered decisioning broadly outside of the banking industry, almost no one does this. They don't even think about it, right? So they have, to your point, John, no idea whether automating this or improving its accuracy is worth a penny. They think it is. We think it is, but it's really hard to find out because they don't do this kind of comparison.
Right. It requires investment, as you're saying.
Yeah.
And a real commitment. And it just seems to me that more and more folks are going to be having to seriously consider this to know what the hell they're getting from these investments in these wacky AI things.
Yeah, and you see experimentation in the development of the analytics in machine learning and AI, and they'll do a lot of like comparison testing and everything else, but they rarely take it into production. So what you don't, and as Dean Abbott, one of my old friends in data mining, said, the problem with all this stuff is carbon-based life forms. In the end, you have to interact with them. and they don't always do what you think they're going to do, right? And so the only way to tell that strategy B is better than strategy A is to actually take some carbon-based life forms and try them with strategy A and some other very similar carbon-based life forms and try strategy B. There's no other way. Nothing else is going to give you the data, right?
Was that Neil?
No, that was Dean Abbott.
Okay. Anyway, thank you, James. That's really insightful. Rob, over to you.
James, let's talk more about carbon-based life form, right? So actually, that's a great segue in. So, listen, for the audience, a while back, James and John and I got together, and we are quite certain that decision management is really important to our audience. And we're also quite certain that if you have questions and issues associated with this, you should talk to James. You should talk to Polaris, because they know it quite well. But we did think it was important for our audience to know. And one of the things I want to talk about is these carbon-based life forms that are going to have to be there to support a strategy that moves you in this direction. You're going to have technology requirements. The business is going to have things in which they're going to have to participate. There is developer skills. Take us through this, James. What are the types of skills, and how do I think about setting up my people for success in one of these initiatives?
So there's a couple of things that we see over and over again that come up a lot, right? The first is being very outcome oriented. And when it comes to decisions, we often joke about, we use as a, not joke, but as a serious point of view, sort of we say decisions first. What decision is it you're trying to get better at? What does better mean? How would you tell you were better at it? And only once you know that, then working backwards to, well, what technology will help you improve that decision in that way? And so technologists have to get really good at being outcome focused. And I know we've all been saying this for a long time, right? You can't say, I want to use tech X. You have to say, I want to solve business problem Y, and tech X looks like it will help me solve business problem Y, right? And so I think this becomes, it's always been important in decisioning. I think it's generally broadly important, but I think it's particularly important because you almost always need a mix of technologies. Generative AI is rarely the only thing you need to solve one of these problems. We're increasingly building systems where there's generative AI, there's machine learning, more sort of traditional machine learning stuff. There's a bunch of explicit logic business rules being modeled. And there are still some human decisions that are part and parcel of how all of this gets glued together, as well as a whole bunch of reporting and data analysis for tracking and watching whether the train is staying on the track or not, right? And that's a broad set of technologies that have to be cohered around a business outcome. So I think from a technology point of view, the first thing is to be really outcome focused and to recognize that you've got to find ways to bring these technologies together. You can't just say, oh, I've got an AI center of excellence, they're doing the AI thing, and then my coders are writing this stuff. And, it's not really going to fly. I mean, Lowcode's, I'm preaching to the choir with you two, I'm sure, but that's an issue, right? And in particular, when it comes to data, right? Because one of my pet peeves is everyone says, I can't do this because I don't have the data. And I'm like, given you don't know what this is, you can't possibly know whether you have the data or not. Right? We've done projects where the accuracy of the analytic was described by the businesses as long as it's better than 50-50, it's fine. Well, because it was a particular context with a particular decision and a particular framework. In that context, that's what they needed. Right? So in that outcome, they could improve that outcome with a 50%, 50-50, 60-40 model. And we could build that really cheaply because we had the data for that. Now, if they'd come back and said, we need a 99% model, we'd have said, we can't build that for you because we don't have the data. But you have to know what the outcome is, right? So you've got to be really outcome focused. I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is from a business perspective, one of the challenges with so much of this tech is that business people don't engage with it. Like they want to throw it over the fence to AI, to IT. And John and I worked in business rules for years, right? And all these business rules technologies allow you to empower people to change the rules. And people say, well, do they? And I'm like, well, sometimes yes, but sometimes no. So, well, is it IT that won't let them? Sometimes, but sometimes it's business people who are like, I like being able to send my little emails and tell my IT guys to fix this problem and yell at them when it breaks. I don't want to own that problem. So, they got to engage with this technology, right? They've got to feel like they've got to increase their degree of ownership. There's a two-way street. Right? IT has to let them become part of this conversation and engage them, but they have to step up and say, if the system's down, that's IT's problem. If the system is behaving incorrectly, that's my problem. I own the behavior of the system. They don't own the behavior of the system. I own it. And that's a hard lesson for some of them to take on board. We've literally had people say, I don't want to do that. Tell IT to do something else, right? So there's that. And then I think sorry, go ahead.
Do you find it's generational, James?
It's certainly better.
People are more up for it?
Yes, younger people are certainly more up for it. I think with younger audiences, it's more about making them recognize the value of things like CI/CD pipelines and version control and stuff like that, rather than just going off and hacking things. Yeah, because we're mostly dealing with very large companies that are often regulated, right? But yeah, older folks in particular, and management teams in particular, right? If you've ever watched a management team or a board meeting and they'll have a topic will come up on HR policy, the HR person will explain it. Everyone, even though they're not HR experts, will engage and think about it. The facilities guy will bring up something and everyone will engage and think about it. The IT guy brings something up and half the room just goes, that's tech, do whatever you want. And it's pathetic, right? And it's just like, it's not going to work in this new era, right? They've got to be engaged with this stuff. You need to be more engaged with it. And then to that point we made about experimentation, I think the reality is, and I think is some of this stuff is probabilistic. So you have to be willing to try things. There's a great phrase Eric Siegel uses. He says, models are probabilistic, but people are very reluctant to run their business probabilistically.
Hold that thought, James.
Yeah.
That is really... You're taking us through the break into the next section here. So John's going to give us a quick commercial break, and then I want to dig in on exactly what you just started into. Right?
I thought Rob's head just exploded.
My head exploded?
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Time for a little bit of promotion. This is, you are watching and listening to Lowdown on Lowcode, a weekly podcast produced by Analysis.tech. Rob and I are two of the analysts and principals at Analysis.tech. We have other colleagues. We have our colleague Francis Carden, who founded one of the first RPA companies, for example, sold it to Pega. Dave Marcus, been in process automation for years and is an expert in business development and partnership. Ryan Duguid, longtime chief product officer, and has built a couple of low-code products. Very, 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 very expertise, very, very much an expert there. Andy Bartels, our economist, our chief economist. We have a new colleague, Rick Greenwald, who, James, you'll be happy to know, he's a data guy. He's going to help us. He's going to help us with those gnarly data problems. Who am I missing, Rob? Anybody? I think that's it.
No, I think you got them all.
Okay.
He's getting bigger.
Regretting that. Anyway, if you like the podcast, if you find it useful, please like us. Tell your friends. And we're here every week. We've got great episodes lined up from vendors, from experts. James is a vendor, but also an expert, and even end user customers. So, Rob, back over to you for your favorite topic.
So find us on analysis.tech. James, right before we broke, you started getting into this topic of mixing deterministic approaches with probabilistic approaches. Obviously, I think much of what gets us excited about AI is its predictive capabilities, which are by nature probabilistic and incredibly powerful. And probably in many, maybe most instances, many instances, we can identify better at making decisions than a human might be. But we're also sort of in a world where sometimes risk is something we have to account for. We're trying to automate more. We're trying to automate faster. We're trying to bring more people in. And at the same time, we're trying to take this powerful new kind of potentially risky technology and mix it in with our more traditional way of doing things. How do you advise clients on mixing deterministic and probabilistic outcomes for the best results with the least risk?
Right. So first of all, we encourage them to mix them, right? That's the number one thing, right? It's just like, it's very, there are a few regulatory based systems, compliance and eligibility kind of things where it's all rules based. It's just basically, there's a set of rules defined by the regulation. Do you meet them all or not? Easy, right? Just, don't read anything else. But most systems require a mix of these things, right? They require some probabilistic and some predictive things because the world is not terribly straightforward. And so to your point, Rob, you're making a risk assessment. And often people are used to thinking of particular pieces of data as though they're bits of data, like a credit score. But a credit score is a model of probabilistic risk. It says basically how likely are you, I forget the exact terms for a FICO score because it's like the Coke formula. It's one of these things that no one knows the whole thing. But it's something like, how likely is it that it's a measure of how likely it is that you're going to get more than a certain number of days late with more than a certain number of payments in the next so many days. Right? It's basically a probabilistic measure of how likely you are to miss a payment. Right? Something like that. And so, but it's treated like it's a score, like it's a number, right? Like you can greater than this, less than that, but it's really probabilistic, right? But it's been proven over and over and over again, right? And what we forget often is back when they introduced it back in, I want to say 57, something like that, they wrote to like hundreds of banks saying, hey, we have this great new credit score. It's better than your credit people. One bank agreed to apply that. So back then, no one believed in credit scoring. Now everyone takes credit scores totally for granted, right? So I think we'll see the same evolution, right? People will adopt probabilistic scores and models in new circumstances, right? But I think you have to mix them. Because our experience is you very rarely want to rely only on a probabilistic thing. Is almost always something more. And the second thing we would say is, if you're going to use probabilistic technology, one of the ways to sort of mitigate the risk is to really focus on high volume environments. We often joke that if you have a decisioning problem, if you have a high volume transaction or interaction where it's not immediately obvious what you should do, because then you have to decide what to do, and you have to do it quickly and inexpensively because it's high volume, blah blah blah, right? So at that point, you have a decisioning problem, right? So I think, and if you focus on those high volume transactions, well, then it becomes obvious that you want to find the 10% that are the most problematic and audit them.
Right.
Okay. So then probabilistic doesn't sound so silly, right? Whereas if I start saying I'm going to use machine learning in deciding, which country to do business in to add to my, each year I add one or two countries, I'm going to use it to predict which ones I should do business in. Well, that gets awfully hard, right? It's like using predictive models to predict election outcomes when there's like, only one election, right? Well, it's really hard. Was the model wrong, or did you just, fall into one of the unusual outcomes, right? So that focus on high volume, that focus on mixing and matching these things together. And then to be really explicit about it, we do a lot of work with decision modeling. We do a lot of very explicit thinking about what is the decision and how do you make it? How do you want to make it? So that we are very clear how you're going to consume these things, right? We often talk about working backwards from the outcome. This is the outcome. I have to do these things. I must do these things. I might do these things. How would I know that if I needed to do that? Well, I would predict this. And you sort of work backwards into these things. And there's some great research done by a couple of guys in Europe. They wrote a book, something like decision-centric data analysis or something. And they like said, this problem with being data, doing data analysis is you start with the data you have and analyze it. And he said, quite rightly, what you need to do is say, well, what decision am I trying to make? What analysis would help me make that decision? Okay, how do I find the data that will help me do that analysis, right? So working backwards from the outcome, right? And so this combination of things really helps you go, I need that kind of predictive power in those circumstances. And in those circumstances, it's got to be really accurate, or it doesn't have to be really accurate, because there's, what are my choices, right? And so it's really about mixing and matching this and about being really explicit about it rather than, throwing things against the wall and hoping it sticks.
So just to kind of, let me just kind of push on this just a little bit more. So
sure.
I'm going to model something, ultimately a process, right? I'm bringing on a customer, or I'm handling some sort of request. And I've got this powerful new technology available to me, and there's business assessments, right? This could be a bad way to do that. Air Canada chatbot, classic example, but it just cost them a lot of money, right? It didn't actually, nobody died as a result of it.
Right.
There are other things where you're going to get yourself into regulatory, or compliance type of issues. Can you just give me a quick idea of who the team is to say that's going to look at that and say, yes, that's the appropriate place to apply the right technology, and that's the appropriate place to put the right risk gates in place.
Yeah, so generally, one of the reasons we use decision modeling is it's a visual model. It's like a process model, but it's a decision model. So it's a sort of visual model, and so it lets you get a very broad range of people involved. And typically, that means it's the subject matter experts, the people who own the decision, who make the decision, saying yes, that is in fact how we make the decision, how I understand we're meant to do. Someone from the risk side, who, as you correctly point out, can say, okay, this appears the decisions that the checks we're supposed to impose, the way we do calculations, these things are clearly articulated in here. I see the pieces that I'm expecting to see. And the technologists, particularly the AI and machine learning technologists, have a clearly bounded problem. I need you to predict what the demand for this product is going to be store by store. And I need you to predict next month's usage, sales, store by store. And I need you to do it with data that is the first 27 days of the month. Because in order to get it shipped to you by the end of the month, I need the prediction on day 27, because then I can run the batch on day 27. It's in the trucks, off we go, right? And then they can go off and model it, right? And they very rarely get that. And we've seen a whole bunch of teams, by the way, AI and machine learning teams get laid off because the businesses don't see them generating any value. Right? But almost always, it's not because the ML people can't build models, because I guarantee you they can build models. It's not because they don't have the data, because they've got some data, or they can build models from it. It's that people said things like, tell me something interesting about my data, or look at this data and tell me how I can improve my business. And no one said things like, predict this at this level of accuracy at this time frame, right? In auto insurance, right? If I'm worried about writing a car off or repairing it, right? In order to save money, it does me no good to write it off at the end of the process. Because by that point, I've paid to have it inspected, I've towed it, I've bought you a rental car, I've spent all the money. Right. So it's only useful if I can do it at the beginning of the process. So the model has to say, at first notice of loss, using only the data that you get at first notice of loss, predict how likely it is that we are going to declare this car a write-off, a total loss. How accurate can you get that? And then the business can answer the question, at what point would it be an accurate enough prediction that we're willing to forego all the rest of this stuff and just pay you? Right. And if you can't have that kind of conversation, you're just wasting your money.
James, it just seems like it's such a different perspective on operations. Thinking it's like, there's all these, getting the people lined up and the resources, and then you get to the end, and hopefully you hit the outcome. But this is like using tools early on in the month or the customer journey or whatever it happens to be. And then you would do checkpoints along the way, and the human makes the call. It seems like it's very different.
It is. And one of the phrases that we've used, I wrote a piece for Harvard Business Review with a colleague, and we talked about the difference between having a human in the loop and a human on the loop. And there is a tendency to say, I've got to have a human in the loop. And I'm like, well, the trouble is, if it's a reasonably high volume activity, a human in the loop, as a colleague said, it's just a human airbag. You're really just putting them in the way so you can blame them if it goes wrong, but they don't have the time to do the analysis. And if they did have the time to do the analysis, there was no point in you doing the analysis for them. Right? So there's a sort of like zero-sum game here. It's like either I don't have time to redo the analysis, in which case you're just blaming me for the analysis that's been given to me, or I do have time to do the analysis, in which case you didn't add any value by doing the analysis for me. So it's like, not obvious why this is helpful, right? But if you can have a human on the loop, so the people who understand the business problem are saying, this is how the decision should be made, that becomes much more useful. And we do a lot of corporate systems, and they say, well, if it passes this threshold, it's got to be referred to this person. Where I'm like, okay, why? What decision do they make? And they tell you, well, it's the same decision. They've got to approve the transaction. I'm like, okay, do they have any data you don't have? No. Okay. Do they follow different rules to the rules you follow? No. So it's just so that you can blame them if it goes wrong. It's a bigger deal, so someone more senior has to take the blame. Okay, so we don't really need them to look at it to do that. We could just say, if there's a mistake, there's another decision engine that works out who gets fired.
So
How
maybe
big was
that,
the deal? How senior a person do we need to fire? It's like,
so maybe that's a new role in corporate America. We should make it explicit. You're basically you're the blame guy.
you're the fool guy. Yeah,
You're
right.
the fall guy.
Yeah, I
And
mean, you see it. I mean, it
they-
happens today, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
you talk to like admirals in the Pentagon, right? There was after the big, what was the fat, whatever his name was, the guy with the huge rip-off scandal for the Navy, right? Yeah.
I recall that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Number
Anyway, they changed the rules that anything above a certain level has to be signed off by an admiral. I remember talking to this guy, and he was asked about it, and he said, I get this stack like this that I have to sign, right? And my chief of staff gives me the stack, and I sign them. Now, if any of them are wrong, they'll fire me because I'm the admiral. I signed them, right?
Yeah.
That's the only value I add to this process. is blamability, right?
Well,
Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit to the humans in the loop.
Mhm.
Humans that are being whose effectiveness is being augmented by these systems. We talked about people not wanting to get involved in tech, but there's also the question of adoption. If you create an application for presumably an executive, a decision maker, someone who's really got a lot of influence over the corporate well-being and all that, are you finding resistance among those folks? Do they say like, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm the expert. I don't need this. What are you giving me this for? I've got my own expertise. I'm gonna follow my expertise, my gut." Or are they welcoming these tools?
So it really varies, right? So when we're talking to an executive, because we're talking about high volume transactions, right? So they're not making the decision itself. They're making essentially a meta decision, a decision about decision making. How should we decide this? And our experience is that when you show them the kind of data you can get out of a well-designed decision engine, they think it's fabulous because they can go, okay, show me last month how many people applied for a loan and wanted to buy a car we would have approved, could afford the loan, had good credit, and got turned down because they failed one of our "we don't do business in your part of the world" checks. Okay, there were only 7. Okay, then it doesn't matter, right? Yeah, I don't have to think about that because it's too small a pool, right? I didn't do any work to find that out. They could just go look at the data, right? Because the decision engine remembers why it did all these things, right? So they really like that. It is much more tricky when the decision is one where you're trying to augment a person's actual transactional decision making. So you're John, you got to decide about this high value customer, and I'm trying to augment your decision making about how to treat this high value customer. And what we found is that if you try and get there, people often present this decision support, decision augmentation, decision automation, right? And our experience is the trouble is you can't get from decision support to decision augmentation because people are too flexible. Once you start with decision support, you always get decision support because you just end up with a more and more sophisticated decision support environment. The only way, in our experience, to get decision augmentation is to start at the other end and aim for automation and then fall back to a level of augmentation that makes sense.
Interesting.
So you say, here's a commercial insurance policy. I've got all these factors to consider. A whole bunch of them I can read out of databases. I can get title and everything else. Okay, well, one of the factors is how good are the fire escapes? Okay, I got no idea how to do that. So I need you, John, go look at this place. Don't look at the whole thing. But there's these 3 things that I really need you to go do because I need your expertise. You have to make a judgment. Are the fire escapes any good? Are the bands who play the kind of people who are biker gangs or the kind of people who attract, 20-something drinkers, right? 2 or 3 questions I got to answer, and then I can calculate commercial insurance for them. And I'm we're augmenting each other, right? So it's much more but you have to aim for I
get it.
You have to try and overshoot and back up. Because if you just try and push past it, you run slap bang into the I'm making the decision. If I'm making the decision, I'm making the decision, right? So
right. That's a great point. Thank you, James. Rob, back over to you.
So James, in my mind, maybe I'm going to say that you're a DMN guy and I'm a BPMN guy.
Right. Yes.
Just
that's certainly true. Decision model and notation.
Labels, and there's probably somebody who's looking at RPA, and there's somebody who's looking at content intelligence, and there's a lot of technologies that make up an automation strategy. How
Yep.
important is it to have a holistic sort of architecture and end-to-end strategy around how these pieces work and where they are applied most effectively?
I mean, I think it is very important to have a sense of the capabilities you need to be effective, right? And to be clear what those capabilities are and who has them, where you have them, and how you can apply them to a problem. And I think for many organizations, it is also tremendously helpful if they have a set of architectural patterns, essentially, that say how they like to combine those things. Without being too prescriptive, all systems must do X, all systems must do Y, because we find that the development approach is a little bit different for some of these applications. The way you approach the problems is a little bit different. And so you want the capability, you want to be focused on capabilities, right? I got to have a capability to, automate legacy systems like with RPA kind of thing, right? I've got to have a capability to understand my data. There's these capabilities I need, which I have tooling and can staffing. But I also need some sense of what my typical patterns are. Because I need to be able to look at my development approach and look at my CI/CD approach and look at my testing approach and say, is that appropriate for this kind of system? And we've had people, for instance, who buy BRMS and then say things like, well, of course, we're going to use our standard development methodology for our BRMS. And we're like, no, really, you're not. Because you're not going to write user stories because they don't work for rules. So, I guess you can, but we would strongly advise you not to. Just like, well, if you want to lay out a workflow, we would suggest you use a process model. If you want to design a database, we suggest you use a data model. And if you want to design a decision, we should just use a decision model. And the different decision modeling, the different modeling techniques. So solution modeling is a capability you should have, but it should be, focused on the things you're using. So I think there's a long-winded way of saying, I think it can be very helpful to have a well-defined architecture for how these pieces fit together. But I'm not sure it's absolutely essential to succeed with the text. I think it's more important that you're clear what the capabilities are and what they can and can't do, and have some way to have those conversations internally.
Thanks, James. John?
Last question. There are folks out there that are sounding the alarm about AI. Here you are working actively with companies that are putting this tech to use. What scares you, if anything, about this technology?
Well, I mean, first of all, I say what doesn't scare me, right? So we have a lot of successful projects right now using AI in what you might call an interface kind of way. Reading documents, summarizing documents, interacting with humans to gather data, turning a log of a process or a decision into a narrative of why that was why we did what we did, that kind of stuff. And it's great. It's very reliable. It's very effective. The idea that you've got to invest in content management, in this sort of hugely expensive content extraction tech doesn't seem to be true anymore. You can just ask an AI, does this document say it's from John? And it says no, right? It's done. So that stuff works really well, right? What does scare me a little bit is as always that the folks who think it's a magic button, right? They can say I'm going to use AI and I won't need to do any of these other things. I think that's always problematic. I think our experience is that it can really magnify sloppy thinking. So if you're sloppy about how you're thinking, you can be sloppy very very quickly, right? But and I think to our point we made right at the beginning, I think it's really important that companies think about why they use tech. And there are folks out there for sure who say we don't really use tech, we try to avoid using tech. We work with a trucking-oriented company and they invested in tech, and then they were like, actually, we're just not very good at this tech stuff. What we're good at is like drivers and trucks and stuff. So we're going to do that. So that's going to be our secret sauce, right? So, but if you are going to use tech, why? Is it all about driving down your costs? Is it about making it high tech? The more clear you are about that, I think the less scary the tech will be. I think there's a well understood intent and direction. Right. Goes a long way. I am actually in some ways, I'm a little bit scared that we're going to end up in well-intentioned legislation driving some of this tech almost underground.
Mm.
California just wrote a law, for instance, on denials of medical coverage. And 99% of the amendment is fabulous. It's really well written. It doesn't talk about AI distinct from software, distinct from machine learning. It just says, essentially algorithmic decision making. It's got a lot of really good stuff. You've got to be able to explain it. It's got to be transparent. You can't use things you can't explain. Really good stuff. But then it implies that there's got to be a human making the final decision, which has two fatal flaws. Firstly, it assumes humans are consistent and accurate, which they're not, right? And secondly, it basically, no, it doesn't forbid it, but it makes it very hard to see how you could have a human on the loop. So if I'm writing rules that say, these are the circumstances in which we regard this treatment as medically necessary, even if those rules consume a probabilistic model that says it's 80% likely that you have diabetes or whatever it is, right? Those are defensible medical rules written by a medical professional that are being applied to your claim. Why is that not okay? I understand it's not okay if that was written by a bean counter or a programmer. But if your chief medical officer sat down and said, that's how we should decide, it's something that's our standard of care, and that's what's running in the code, why is that not okay? Yeah, it has to be okay, right? And I think they have to think hard about how to write these regulations to focus on transparency, manageability, explainability, and this commitment, and that the right kind of people own the algorithm. Yep. So if you're the chief medical officer of a plan and it denies someone coverage, you ought not to be able to defend yourself by saying it's in code, I didn't see it. Right. Absolutely true. You should absolutely not be able to defend yourself that way. It'd be like, too bad. Yeah. It was on you. Yeah.
Unless you put that computer on the stand in a legal situation, right?
Exactly. You were the human in that loop. Exactly.
Yeah, there needs to be a human. Yeah. Yep.
But this this implication that it's got to be at a transactional level, I think, is a little bit worrying, because I think that will mean that countries that do that will put their companies at a big disadvantage. Right. Some countries or industries won't do, and then we'll get like really bad outcomes. I think you've got to you're not trying to stop it here; you're trying to regulate it.
Right. So, I mean, we do sort of see the news and see, some of the news coming out about the average denial from one of the companies being 2 seconds. Right. And, and massive numbers of denials. So we need to think about it more carefully. And we need to think about it more planfully as well. So, hey, John, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
Guys, James, thank you so much. If you've
thank you.
If you've been fascinated by what James has shared today, as we were so delighted to have him on, decisionmanagementsolutions.com. Is where you can find Blue Polaris. Also, take a look at James' book. Really, some great stuff. Digital decisioning using decision management to deliver business impact from AI. Fabulous information in there as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, James.
Thank you very much, John. Rob, it was great to be here.
Yeah,
Thank you, James.